The letter had travelled 52 years in a dead man's wallet. Heinrich Vogel's daughter found it 3 hours after he died. May 12, 1997. Hamburg University Hospital, room 347. Her father's body still warm under the white sheet, his right hand curled tight around something even death couldn't make him release. Helga had to pry his fingers open one by one. The paper was yellow, thin as tissue, folded into a square small enough to hide in a palm. The creases had worn through in places where 52 years of opening and closing had made the paper remember its shape. She unfolded it carefully. The ink had faded to brown, but the words were still clear. Heinrich, thank you for your good work. You honored Robert's memory by being decent. If you ever return to Arkansas, you have a friend here. Caleb Porter, December 1945. Helga read it twice. She had never heard of Caleb Porter. She had never heard her father mention Arkansas. In 78 years of life, Heinrich Vogel had said almost nothing about the war, except that he'd been captured in North Africa and spent time in an American prison camp. When Helga was young, she'd asked him once what it was like. He'd looked at her for a long moment, then said only, "They treated us well, better than we deserved." She'd assumed he meant the treatment was adequate. Standard. She'd assumed prison had been exactly what prison should be, a punishment endured and then forgotten. But men don't carry adequate treatment in their wallets for 52 years. And men don't die clutching letters from prison camps unless those letters mean something that words can't hold. Helga stood in the hospital room with her father's body and a stranger's letter, and understood that she had never known her father at all. The nurse came in to ask about arrangements. Helga folded the letter back into its creases and put it in her purse. Later, she would try to find Caleb Porter. Later, she would try to understand what Arkansas had meant to her father. But that was later. First, there was the funeral. And after the funeral, there was the apartment to clean out. And in the apartment, in a wooden box in the back of her father's closet, Helga would find 47 letters her father had written to his mother during the war. Letters he'd never sent. Letters that described food and guilt and kindness that felt illegal. But that discovery was still weeks away. Right now, in this moment, Helga only knew that her father had died holding something he couldn't let go. She looked down at his face. Even in death, he looked troubled, like a man who'd spent his whole life trying to solve a problem he couldn't name. The nurse cleared her throat gently. Helga nodded. Yes, she would sign the papers. Yes, she would make the arrangements. Yes, she understood. She took one last look at her father's face and whispered what she wished she'd asked him, while he could still answer, "Papa, what happened in Arkansas?" 52 years earlier, June 12, 1943, 8:47 in the morning. Heinrich Vogel stood on a train platform in southeastern Arkansas and held a tin cup that was still warm from real coffee. Not the roasted grain substitute he'd been drinking since 1941. Not the chicory blend they'd given the troops in Tunisia. Real coffee. Arabica beans hot water, the smell so rich it made his eyes water. The American soldiers had served it an hour ago with breakfast on the Pullman car that had carried him 1,200 miles across America. Served it like it was nothing. Like prisoners of war drank real coffee every morning. Heinrich had taken the cup with both hands and brought it to his face before drinking. Breathed in the steam. Let it fill his nose and throat. Let it remind him of Hamburg in 1938 before the war, when his mother would buy real coffee once a month, and they'd drink it on Sunday mornings while his father read the newspaper. Then he'd tasted it. Black. No sugar. The bitterness hit first, then smoothed into something warm and almost sweet, coating his tongue and throat like liquid silk. He'd closed his eyes. For 5 seconds, the war disappeared. For 5 seconds, there was only coffee and the rocking motion of the train and sunlight coming through clean windows. Then Corporal Elwood Hayes had said, "Drink up, boy, long day ahead." And Heinrich had remembered he was a prisoner. Now he stood on the platform at Camp Dermot with the empty cup still in his hand and tried to understand what kind of prison served its captives better food than their own army had provided. The camp stretched out before him, 640 acres of flat delta farmland, rows of wooden barracks painted white, a mess hall, a recreation building, administrative offices, all of it clean, all of it new, no bomb damage, no rubble, no craters. The sky above Arkansas was blue and empty, no planes, no smoke, just heat and humidity and the smell of cut grass. Heinrich was 24 years old. He'd been born in Hamburg in 1919, grew up in a modest apartment near the Elbe River. His father had worked in a radio factory. Heinrich had followed him into the trade, became good with electronics, good with his hands. Then 1939 came, and the draft notice arrived, and suddenly Heinrich was a soldier, whether he wanted to be or not. 4 years of war, 2 years fighting across North Africa, mechanic in a panzer division keeping tanks running in sand and heat, watching men die from British shells and American bombs and simple exhaustion. Then Tunisia, April 1943, surrounded, no ammunition, no fuel, no water. The Americans came and Heinrich put his hands up and became a prisoner. That was 3 months ago. 3 months of processing camps and medical checks and interrogations that weren't really interrogations, just American officers asking basic questions and writing down answers. Then the ship across the Atlantic packed in with 2,000 other German prisoners, all of them expecting brutality, all of them getting regular meals instead. Then the train across America, the Pullman car with seats that reclined, the countryside passing by the windows, all of it intact, all of it abundant, cities with no bomb damage, farms with full fields, and the food. God, the food. Breakfast this morning had included bacon, 6 strips on a white plate. Heinrich had stared at them for a full minute before touching anything. The bacon was thick cut, properly smoked. The fat had rendered and crisped at the edges, and when Heinrich finally picked up a piece, it was still hot. The first bite cracked between his teeth, salt crystals visible on the surface. The fat melted immediately, coating his mouth, the smoke flavor coming through underneath, rich and deep and complex. Heinrich had eaten all 6 pieces slowly, very slowly, trying to memorize the taste, trying to understand how prisoners of war got bacon while his own army had been feeding him black bread and potato soup for 2 years. The other prisoners on the train had eaten the same way, slowly, carefully, men who couldn't quite believe their own tongues. Werner Hoffmann, captured the same day as Heinrich outside Tunis, had stared at his plate and said quietly, "This is more food than I had in 3 days before we surrendered." Heinrich had nodded. He couldn't speak. His mouth was full of bacon and his eyes were wet and he didn't understand anything anymore. Their commanding officer before capture had warned them what to expect if the Americans took them: forced labor in terrible conditions, beatings, starvation rations. The officer had said American propaganda about humane treatment was lies designed to make German soldiers surrender. The officer had been very clear, very certain. The officer had been wrong. Now Heinrich stood on the platform at Camp Dermot and watched as 200 German prisoners filed off the train and formed rough lines for processing. American soldiers directed them calmly. No shouting, no guns pointed, just firm directions and pointing fingers. Ernst Bachmann stepped up beside Heinrich, 26-year-old law student from Heidelberg, captured in Sicily 2 months ago. They'd met on the ship crossing the Atlantic. Ernst was tall and thin, with intelligent eyes, and the kind of voice that made other men listen. He looked around the camp and said quietly in German, "This doesn't look like a prison." "No," Heinrich agreed, "it doesn't. The Geneva Convention requires equal treatment with the captor nation's soldiers," Ernst said, like he was explaining something to himself. "The Americans follow rules." "The bacon," Heinrich said. "Prisoners don't get bacon." Ernst looked at him. "Maybe American soldiers get bacon." Heinrich had no answer for that. It was possible. It was even logical. But logic didn't make the bacon feel less strange in his stomach. Logic didn't make the real coffee taste less like a dream. Corporal Hayes called out in broken German, "Line up! Processing! Fast!" The prisoners formed lines. Heinrich ended up near the front. He still held the tin cup from breakfast. An American soldier took it from him gently and pointed toward a table where 3 soldiers sat with clipboards and typewriters. The processing took 20 minutes. Name, serial number, date of capture, location of capture, any medical conditions, any injuries. The American soldiers were professional, efficient. One of them spoke decent German. When Heinrich gave his information, the soldier typed it onto a form, had Heinrich sign it, then handed him a piece of paper with a number. "Barrack 7, the soldier said. "Bunk 14. Report to mess hall at 6 tonight for dinner. Tomorrow morning, 6:30, work assignments." Heinrich took the paper. The soldier pointed toward a row of barracks on the left side of the camp. That was it. No interrogation, no search, no threats. Just a number and a bunk assignment and directions to dinner. Heinrich walked to Barrack 7. The building was new, pine wood painted white with screened windows and a door that wasn't locked. Inside, 40 beds arranged in 2 rows. Each bed had a mattress, not a cot, not boards, an actual mattress with a pillow and 2 wool blankets folded at the foot. Heinrich found bunk 14. He sat down carefully. The mattress compressed under his weight, real springs underneath. He pressed his hand into the fabric. Clean. No lice, no stains. Above each bunk was a single electric light bulb. Heinrich reached up and pulled the cord. The bulb lit immediately. Bright white light. He pulled the cord again and it went dark. Electricity. In a prison barrack. For prisoners. Ernst Bachmann took the bunk next to Heinrich's. Bunk 15. He sat down and looked around the room. Other prisoners were doing the same thing, sitting, testing the mattresses, looking at the lights. Nobody spoke. The silence was thick with confusion. Finally, Ernst said what everyone was thinking. "There are no locks on the doors." Heinrich looked at the door. Ernst was right. No locks, no bars, just a screen door and a wooden door behind it. "No guards inside either," another prisoner said, a short man with a Munich accent. Bunk 11. "Just us." "They must have guards outside," someone else said. "Didn't see any," Munich said. Heinrich stood up and walked to the door, pushed it open, stepped outside. The afternoon sun hit him immediately. 95 degrees, maybe more. The humidity made it worse, but he could see clearly. The camp spread out in all directions. Barracks, buildings, open spaces, and in the distance, maybe 200 yards away, a white painted line on the ground. That was it. No fence, no barbed wire, no guard towers, just a line painted in the dirt. Ernst came up beside him, looked where Heinrich was looking. "That's the boundary," Ernst said quietly. "Just a line," Heinrich said. "We could step over it." "And go where?" Heinrich asked. "We're in Arkansas, middle of America, 1,000 miles from the ocean, and they're feeding us bacon." Ernst laughed. It was a short, sharp sound. Not really amused, just the sound of a man who didn't know what else to do. They went back inside, lay down on their bunks, stared at the ceiling. At 5 o'clock, a whistle blew. Heinrich sat up. Ernst was already standing. The other prisoners were moving toward the door. Heinrich followed them outside where Corporal Hayes stood with a clipboard. "Mess hall," Hayes said in his broken German. "Follow." They followed him across the camp to a long wooden building with screens on the windows and the smell of cooking food drifting out. Inside, tables with benches. A serving line with American soldiers behind a counter, metal trays and utensils in bins. Heinrich picked up a tray, moved through the line. The first soldier put a large piece of beef on his plate, brown gravy over the top. The next soldier added mashed potatoes, real potatoes, not dehydrated powder. The next added green beans. The next gave him 2 slices of white bread with a pat of butter. The last handed him a cup of coffee. Heinrich carried his tray to a table and sat down. Ernst sat across from him. They both looked at their trays. The beef portion was larger than Heinrich's fist. The potatoes were smooth and creamy. The bread was fresh. The butter was real. "This is better than anything I got in the Wehrmacht," Ernst said quietly. Heinrich nodded. He couldn't speak. His throat was too tight. He picked up his fork, cut a piece of the beef, put it in his mouth. The meat was tender, properly cooked. The gravy was rich with fat and salt. He chewed slowly, swallowed, cut another piece. Around him, 200 German prisoners ate in silence. Some of them were crying. Some of them just stared at their plates like they were seeing something impossible. Some of them ate with the desperate speed of men who'd been hungry for years. Heinrich ate slowly, each bite deliberate, each bite catalogued. Beef, potatoes, beans, bread, butter, coffee, real food, good food, food that didn't taste like war. When he finished, his plate was clean. His stomach was full. For the first time in 3 years, Heinrich wasn't hungry, and he had no idea what that meant. They walked back to the barracks in the evening heat. The sun was setting. Long shadows across the camp, insects singing in the grass. No sounds of artillery, no sounds of aircraft. Just insects and heat and the quiet conversation of men trying to understand what was happening to them. Heinrich lay on his bunk as darkness came. The electric bulb above his head stayed off. He didn't need light. He needed to think. He'd been a prisoner of war for exactly 9 hours. In those 9 hours, he'd been given clean clothes, a bed with a mattress, electric lights, hot food and coffee. Real coffee. He'd been processed efficiently and treated firmly, but fairly. No one had hit him. No one had threatened him. No one had even raised their voice. This was supposed to be prison. This was supposed to be punishment. This was supposed to be the brutality his commanding officer had warned him about. Instead, it felt like the best assignment he'd ever received in 4 years of military service. Heinrich closed his eyes, tried to sleep, but sleep wouldn't come. His mind kept circling back to the same question. Why? Why treat enemy soldiers this well? Why feed them bacon and give them real coffee and put them in barracks with unlocked doors? He didn't have an answer. And not having an answer made everything else feel unstable, like the ground under his feet wasn't quite solid. At some point, he did sleep, and he dreamed of bacon. Morning came at 6:30 with a whistle. Heinrich sat up disoriented for a moment, then remembered where he was. Camp Dermot, Arkansas, America. Outside, Corporal Hayes was calling for morning count. The prisoners filed out and formed lines in front of the barracks. An American officer walked down the lines counting silently. When he finished, he nodded to Hayes, who consulted his clipboard and started calling out names and work assignments. Vogel Heinrich. Heinrich stepped forward. Cotton chopping crew. Truck leaves in 30 minutes. Breakfast first. Breakfast was eggs. Scrambled. Real eggs, not powdered, with toast and butter and jam, and more coffee. Heinrich ate everything, drank 2 cups of coffee, filled his stomach because he didn't know when he'd eat again. At 7:30, he climbed into the back of a truck with 19 other prisoners. Corporal Hayes rode in the front. They drove 8 miles east through flat farmland. Cotton fields stretched in every direction. Young plants, maybe 6 inches high, rose perfectly straight, going on for what looked like miles. The truck stopped at a white farmhouse with a barn and equipment sheds. An old man came out, thin, maybe 65, wearing overalls and a straw hat. He walked over to Hayes and they talked for a minute. Then Hayes turned to the prisoners. This is Leonard Whitmore, his farm. You work for him today. Cotton chopping. He shows you how. You do good work. Understand? The prisoners nodded. Whitmore walked to the back of a shed and returned with long-handled hose. He demonstrated the technique. Walk down the row, remove extra plants, leave 1 plant every 12 inches, let the strong ones grow. The prisoners watched. Whitmore's hands moved with the efficiency of a man who'd done this 10,000 times. Then he handed out the hose and pointed to the field. Heinrich took a hoe and walked to a row, started chopping. He'd never done farm work before. City boy from Hamburg. Radios and electronics and engines, not plants and soil. But the technique wasn't complicated, just repetitive. Bend, chop, move, bend, chop, move. 1 plant every 12 inches. The sun climbed higher. By 9 o'clock it was 85 degrees. By 11 it was 95. The humidity made it feel like breathing through wet cloth. Heinrich's shirt soaked through with sweat. His hands developed blisters where the hoe handle rubbed. He worked 4.5 hours and covered maybe 200 yards. The field stretched for half a mile in both directions. At noon, Whitmore called a halt. Corporal Hayes handed out sandwiches and water from a cooler in the truck bed. Heinrich sat in the shade of the truck and unwrapped his sandwich. Ham and cheese. 4 slices of ham, thick, real cheese, not the ersatz they'd gotten in the army. Lettuce, mayonnaise on white bread. The sandwich was heavy in his hands. Heinrich bit into it. The ham was salty and sweet at the same time, properly cured. The cheese was sharp. The mayonnaise was rich with fat. The bread was soft. He chewed slowly, tried to make it last. A small boy appeared from the farmhouse, maybe 8 years old, wearing short pants and no shirt. He walked up to the prisoners and stared with open curiosity. No fear, just a child's interest in new people. The boy said something in English. Heinrich didn't understand. Ernst was sitting nearby. He'd learned some English in university. "He asks why we're here," Ernst translated. "Tell him we're prisoners," Heinrich said. Ernst spoke to the boy in halting English. The boy's eyes went wide. He asked another question. "He asks if we're dangerous," Ernst said. Heinrich almost laughed. "Tell him no, we're just tired," Ernst translated. The boy nodded seriously. Then he asked something else, and Ernst's expression changed, became softer. "He asks why you're crying," Ernst said to Heinrich. Heinrich reached up and touched his face. His cheeks were wet. He hadn't realized he was crying. "Tell him," Heinrich said quietly. "Tell him this sandwich is better than anything I had in my army for 2 years. Tell him I don't know what that means." Ernst translated. The boy looked at Heinrich for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out a peppermint candy, and held it out. Heinrich took it. The boy smiled and ran back to the farmhouse. Heinrich unwrapped the candy and put it in his mouth. Peppermint flooded his senses, sweet and sharp and cold. He closed his eyes and let the taste fill his mouth while tears ran down his face, and he didn't try to stop them. Work resumed at 1 o'clock. The afternoon heat was relentless. Heinrich's blisters broke and bled. He wrapped his hands in cloth torn from his undershirt and kept working. At 2:30, one of the prisoners collapsed. Josef, a quiet man from Stuttgart. Hayes gave him water and shade. After 15 minutes, Josef recovered enough to sit up. At 5 o'clock, Hayes blew his whistle. The prisoners walked back to the truck exhausted and filthy and drenched in sweat. 10.5 hours of hard manual labor under a brutal sun. Heinrich's back screamed. His hands were raw. His legs shook. But when they got back to camp, there were hot showers. Not warm. Hot. Real hot water with soap that actually lathered. Heinrich stood under the spray for 5 minutes, letting the water wash away the dirt and sweat and some of the confusion. At 6, dinner. Meat again. This time pork chops with applesauce, corn on the cob, biscuits, coffee. Heinrich ate everything. His body needed the calories. His mind needed the ritual. After dinner, the camp medic called him over. The medic was maybe 40 with kind eyes and steady hands. He cleaned Heinrich's blisters with alcohol-applied ointment and wrapped both hands in clean white gauze. Professional, efficient, completely unconcerned that Heinrich was an enemy soldier. Heinrich tried to thank him, but the medic waved him off and pointed to the next prisoner in line. Heinrich walked back to Barrack 7, lay down on his bunk, stared at the ceiling. His body hurt, but it was the clean pain of honest work. His hands throbbed, but they were wrapped in clean bandages. His stomach was full. He was clean. He was safe. This was prison. This was supposed to be punishment. This was supposed to be everything his commanding officer had warned him about. Instead, it felt like mercy. And Heinrich didn't know how to process that. Didn't know how to reconcile what he'd been told with what he was experiencing. The gap between propaganda and reality was too wide to bridge. He fell asleep thinking about ham sandwiches and peppermint candy and a small boy who'd given him kindness for no reason at all. The days developed a rhythm. Wake at 6:30, count, breakfast, work assignment, 8 to 10 hours of hard labor, Lunch in the field, more work, return to camp, shower, dinner, free time, sleep. The work was brutal, cotton chopping in heat that turned the air into soup. Heinrich's body adapted slowly. His hands developed calluses. His back grew stronger. By the end of the second week, he could work a full day without collapsing. Leonard Whitmore seemed satisfied with their progress. He never said much, just checked the rows and nodded. Sometimes his grandson came to the field. The boy, his name was Fletcher Heinrich, learned would watch the prisoners work and ask questions in English that Ernst would translate. Fletcher was curious about Germany, about the war, about why the men were so far from home. He wasn't afraid. To him, the German soldiers were just men who worked in his grandfather's fields. By late July, the routine felt almost normal. The camp had established recreation periods, a soccer field, a volleyball court, a small library with German books donated by the YMCA. Some of the prisoners organized informal games. Others read. Some just sat in the shade and tried to remember what peace felt like. Ernst Bachmann organized classes, mathematics, history, literature. Ernst had been a law student before the war. He was determined to continue his education even as a prisoner. A dozen other prisoners joined his classes. They met in the evenings under the electric lights in the barracks and worked through problems and discussed ideas and tried to maintain some connection to the lives they'd had before the war made everything impossible. Heinrich attended sometimes. Mostly he just listened. He'd never been academic like Ernst. But he liked hearing someone talk about things that weren't war or work or survival. It made the world feel larger than Camp Dermot. In August, the camp administration made an announcement. The University of Arkansas would provide correspondence courses. The courses would be taught in German. Credits earned would be recognized by German universities after the war. Ernst enrolled immediately. So did 40 other prisoners. They attacked the coursework with the intensity of men who needed to believe in a future. Heinrich didn't enroll. He couldn't imagine a future clearly enough to prepare for it. But he watched Ernst study, and he felt something that might have been hope. The work shifted in September. Now the cotton needed picking. This was worse than chopping. Constant bending, pulling cotton bolls from the plants and stuffing them into long sacks dragged behind. A full sack weighed 60 pounds. Heinrich could barely manage 2 sacks a day. His back protested. His fingers bled from the sharp edges of the bowls. They worked 10-hour days through September and October. The heat began to break as autumn came to Arkansas, but the work stayed hard. By November, the harvest was complete, and the prisoners had earned 80 cents per day credited to camp canteen accounts. Heinrich had accumulated over $40. He bought cigarettes and writing paper. He wrote letters to his mother in Hamburg. He didn't know if they would reach her. Germany was being bombed constantly. Mail service was erratic at best, but he wrote anyway. Told her he was safe. Told her the Americans were treating him well. He didn't tell her how good the food was. He didn't tell her about hot showers or university courses. He was afraid she wouldn't believe him. He was more afraid she would. September 15th, 1943. 3 months into Heinrich's imprisonment at Camp Dermot. The mail call came after dinner. Corporal Hayes read out names. Prisoners stepped forward to collect letters from home. Heinrich didn't expect to hear his name. Mail from Germany was rare. The war made everything uncertain. But Hayes called out, "Vogel Heinrich." Heinrich stood up, walked forward, took the envelope. The paper was thin. The postmark was 3 months old. The address was written in his mother's handwriting. He carried the letter back to his bunk, sat down, held it for a long moment before opening it. Ernst looked over from the next bunk but didn't say anything, didn't ask. Some things were private. Heinrich opened the envelope carefully. The letter inside was written on newspaper margins. Real paper was scarce. His mother's handwriting was shaky but clear. "My dear Heinrich, I received word that you are alive and imprisoned in America. I cannot tell you what relief this brings. Your father is dead. He died in the bombing of July 27th. They hit our neighborhood. Many people died. We could not find his body. There was too much rubble. Your brother Klaus is missing on the Eastern Front. No word in 8 months. I pray he is alive, but I do not have hope. I am living in a refugee center outside the city. I share a room with 3 other women. The food is scarce, but I am managing. Hamburg is not the city you remember. Most of it is gone. The bombings continue. Every night we go to the shelters. Every morning we come out and see what is left. Heinrich, I am glad you are safe. Do not feel guilty. Someone should survive this war. Someone should live to remember what we were before all this. I love you. Eat if they give you food. Stay alive. That is enough, Mother. Heinrich read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope. He lay down on his bunk and stared at the ceiling. His father was dead. His brother was probably dead. His mother was starving in a refugee center. Hamburg was rubble. Everything he'd known, everyone he'd loved, was being destroyed while he lay on a mattress in Arkansas and ate pork chops. At 6 o'clock dinner call, Heinrich couldn't move. Ernst came over, asked quietly if he was sick. Heinrich shook his head, showed Ernst the letter. Ernst read it, didn't say anything. What could he say? There were no words. You should eat, Ernst finally said. I can't. Your mother said to eat. She's starving, Heinrich said. His voice was flat, empty. She's eating scraps. She probably weighs 90 pounds. And I just ate bacon for breakfast. Starving yourself won't help her. I know. Then eat. Heinrich got up, walked to the mess hall, stood in line. Let the soldiers put food on his tray. Pork chops again, applesauce, green beans, cornbread. He carried the tray to a table, sat down, stared at the pork chop. His mother was eating potato peelings. He was eating pork chops. His father had died under rubble. He was sleeping on a mattress. His brother was probably frozen in a Russian field. He had hot showers. The guilt was physical, a weight in his chest that made breathing hurt. He picked up his fork, cut a piece of the pork chop, put it in his mouth, chewed. It tasted like ash. He swallowed anyway. Cut another piece. Ate that too. Worked his way through the entire meal because his mother had told him to eat, and because refusing food wouldn't bring his father back or save his brother or feed his mother. But every bite felt like theft. After dinner, he went to the latrine and vomited everything up. Then he went back to his bunk and lay down, and didn't move until morning. Ernst didn't try to make him talk. Just sat on the next bunk and read his law textbook and was present. Sometimes presence was enough. The next day, Heinrich went back to work, picked cotton for 10 hours, came back, ate dinner, refused dessert. The apple pie sat on his tray untouched. Ernst noticed, but didn't comment. This became Heinrich's new routine. Work, eat the main meal, refuse dessert. As if denying himself one small pleasure could balance out the enormous injustice of his safety. It didn't balance anything, but it was all he could do. October arrived, the heat broke, the nights became cool, the work continued. Heinrich's body was stronger now, his hands were tough, his back had adapted. He could pick 3 sacks of cotton in a day when conditions were good. The camp felt less like a prison and more like a place where men simply existed, worked, ate, slept. Some played soccer in the evenings, some attended Ernst's classes, some wrote letters, some just sat and stared at nothing. Heinrich wrote to his mother every week, told her he was well, told her he was working, told her he hoped she was managing, never mentioned the food, never mentioned how safe he was. The gap between their realities was too obscene to describe. He didn't know if any of his letters reached her. Mail from America to Germany was even more uncertain than mail from Germany to America. But he wrote anyway. The act of writing was its own form of prayer. One evening in mid-October, Heinrich was sitting outside the barracks watching the sunset when Ernst came and sat beside him. "I've been thinking about something," Ernst said. Heinrich waited. "The Americans don't have to treat us this well," Ernst continued. "The Geneva Convention requires adequate food and shelter. It doesn't require bacon and hot water and university courses." "I know," Heinrich said. "So why do they do it?" Heinrich had thought about this question every day for 4 months. He still didn't have a good answer. Maybe they're just following their principles, he said finally. Maybe they actually believe in humane treatment, even for enemies. Apparently. Ernst was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It makes you think our propaganda was wrong about everything else too." Heinrich turned to look at him. Ernst's face was thoughtful, not troubled, just considering. "What do you mean?" Heinrich asked. "We were told the Americans were barbaric, cruel, interested only in profit and power. We were told they had no culture, no honor, no principles." Ernst gestured around the camp. "Does this look like barbarity to you?" "No," Heinrich admitted. "Then maybe we were wrong about other things. Maybe the people we were fighting weren't the monsters we were told they were. Maybe we were fighting for the wrong reasons." It was a dangerous thing to say, even here, even among prisoners. But Ernst said it anyway, and Heinrich understood why. Because once you started doubting one piece of propaganda, all the other pieces became suspect too. "Maybe," Heinrich said quietly. They sat in silence as the sun went down and the Arkansas sky turned orange and purple and finally black. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked. Insects sang in the grass. The air smelled like cut cotton and earth. It was peaceful, unbearably peaceful, the kind of peace Heinrich had forgotten could exist, and that peace felt like the most illegal thing of all. Late October. Week 19 of Heinrich's imprisonment. A new transport of prisoners arrived. 200 men captured in Sicily and shipped across the Atlantic. They filed off the train looking exhausted and suspicious and hungry. Heinrich remembered that look. He'd worn it 4 months ago. The new men were processed and assigned to barracks. Some ended up in Barrack 7. One of them took the bunk 2 down from Heinrich's. His name was Otto from Berlin, 28 years old. He'd been a mechanic before the war, same as Heinrich. They had that in common. They had very little else. Otto was angry, deeply, permanently angry. He'd been a committed party member before the war, believed in the cause, believed in the mission. Being captured hadn't changed his beliefs. It had just given him new enemies to hate. He spent his first week at Camp Dermot looking for things to criticize. The food was a trick to make them soft. The work was designed to break them. The lack of guards meant the Americans were confident they could hunt down anyone who escaped and kill them. Everything had a sinister explanation. Heinrich ignored him. Ernst ignored him. Most of the prisoners ignored him. They'd all gone through the same mental adjustment. They'd all tested the boundaries and found that the boundaries were exactly what they appeared to be, firm but fair. But Otto couldn't accept that. And in early November, he found others who couldn't accept it either. A small group of men who needed the Americans to be cruel because admitting they weren't meant admitting they'd fought for the wrong side. Otto's group was maybe 15 men out of 3,000 in the camp, a tiny minority. But they were vocal. They held meetings in the evenings, talked about resistance, about maintaining discipline, about not becoming too comfortable. Heinrich avoided them. He had enough confusion in his own head without adding Otto's anger to it. But one evening, Otto approached Heinrich directly, sat down at his table in the mess hall without being invited. "You're working well for them," Otto said. His tone made it an accusation. "I work," Heinrich said. "They pay me. That's the arrangement." "You work like you're employed, not like you're a prisoner." Heinrich looked at him. "What do you want me to do?" "Work badly, sabotage equipment that just makes the work harder for everyone." "You should resist," Otto said. "We're German soldiers. We don't collaborate." "I'm not collaborating," Heinrich said. "I'm surviving. There's a difference. You eat their food, you take their money, you sleep in their beds. You're becoming American." "I'm becoming fed," Heinrich said. "My mother is starving in Hamburg. My father is dead. My brother is probably dead. I'm alive and eating regular meals. I'm not going to apologize for that." Otto leaned forward. His voice dropped to a harsh whisper. "Your mother would be ashamed of you." Heinrich stood up. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from rage. "You don't know anything about my mother. I know she didn't raise a son to surrender his principles for bacon. Heinrich almost hit him. Ernst, sitting nearby, stood up quickly and put a hand on Heinrich's shoulder. Walk away, Ernst said quietly. Heinrich looked at Otto's face, saw the contempt there, the rigid certainty, the need to make everything fit the worldview he'd been taught. Heinrich recognized that certainty. He'd felt it himself once, before Tunisia, before Arkansas, before bacon and coffee and kindness that made no sense. You'll figure it out, Heinrich said to Otto. Or you won't. Either way, it's your problem. He walked away. Ernst followed him outside. They stood in the cool November air and said nothing for a while. Finally, Ernst spoke. He's scared. Of what? Heinrich asked. Of being wrong. If the Americans aren't monsters, then maybe we were the monsters. That's too much for some people to accept. Heinrich understood that. He'd struggled with the same thought every day since his mother's letter arrived. The arithmetic was simple and devastating. If the Americans could treat their enemies with such humanity, what did that say about how Germany had treated its enemies? Heinrich didn't have an answer. He suspected no one did, and maybe that uncertainty was the real punishment, not the work or the confinement, just the slow collapse of everything you'd been taught to believe. They walked back to the barracks, lay down on their bunks. Heinrich stared at the ceiling and thought about his mother and bacon and Otto's angry face. Somewhere in the camp, Otto and his 15 followers were probably planning their resistance, their small rebellion against kindness. Heinrich hoped they'd figure it out eventually, hoped they'd realize that accepting good treatment from your enemies didn't make you a traitor, it just made you human. But he knew some men would never figure that out. Some men needed the war to continue forever because peace meant facing what they'd done. Heinrich was tired of war. He was tired of fighting. He was tired of certainty. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep. Tomorrow was another workday, more cotton, more 8-hour shifts in the fields, more meals he didn't deserve, more safety he couldn't justify. But he'd get up anyway, and he'd work, and he'd eat, and he'd survive, because his mother had told him to, and because survival, it turned out, was the only form of resistance that mattered. Winter came to Arkansas in December of 1943. The heat that had made summer work unbearable gave way to cold mornings and frost on the grass. The cotton harvest was finished. The prisoners shifted to different work. Some went to timber operations in the forests north of camp. Some went to road maintenance crews. Some stayed on the farms helping with winter preparation and equipment repair. Heinrich was assigned to a timber crew 20 miles north of Camp Dermot. 20 prisoners, 1 guard working for a man named Caleb Porter, who owned a small sawmill operation in the pine forests that covered the hills above the delta. They met Porter on a grey December morning. The truck dropped them at a clearing where a portable sawmill sat next to stacks of cut lumber. Porter was 52 years old, lean and weathered, with hands that looked like they'd been working wood for 40 years. He wore canvas work pants and a flannel shirt and a hat that had seen better decades. He looked at the 20 German prisoners and said something to Corporal Hayes in English. Hayes nodded and turned to the prisoners. Mr. Porter runs this operation. You work for him. He's fair. Do good work, you'll be treated well. Cause problems, you'll be back at camp breaking rocks. Understand? The prisoners nodded. Porter walked to a pile of cross-cut saws and axes, started handing them out, demonstrated how to work the cross-cut saw safely. 2 men per saw, rhythm matching steady pressure. Let the teeth do the work. Don't force it. The prisoners watched. Porter's movements were efficient, practiced. He'd done this 10,000 times. Then he pointed to the tree line and made a gesture that needed no translation. Get to work. They worked. The trees were Arkansas pine, tall and straight, good timber for construction. Porter would mark a tree and 2 prisoners would work the crosscut saw through the trunk. Others would trim branches. Others would haul the logs to the sawmill. Hard work, but cleaner than cotton. No heat, no blisters from hoe handles, just cold air and the smell of fresh cut pine and the rhythmic sound of saws biting through wood. At 10 o'clock, Porter stopped work, called everyone over. He had a large thermos and a stack of tin cups. He poured coffee and handed cups to the prisoners. Heinrich took a cup, wrapped both hands around it. Porter's coffee was different from the camp mess hall brew. Stronger, richer, like it had been made for men who needed heat in their bones, not just caffeine in their blood. Heinrich let the steam rise into his face. The first sip burned his tongue, then spread downward chest-stomach limbs until even his fingers felt warm. This was ritual. This was respect. This was Porter saying without words, "You're men, not animals." Porter poured himself a cup, stood there drinking it alongside the prisoners, didn't separate himself, didn't treat them like enemies or criminals, just men taking a break from work. Ernst, standing next to Heinrich, said quietly in German, "He's sharing his coffee." "I see that," Heinrich said. "His country is at war with ours." "I know, but he's sharing his coffee." Heinrich didn't have an answer. He just drank the coffee and felt the warmth and tried not to think too hard about what it meant. The coffee became a ritual. Every morning at 10, every afternoon at 3. Porter would stop work and pour coffee and hand out cups. Sometimes he brought cornbread his wife had made, sometimes fried chicken, sometimes biscuits that were still warm. He'd hand out portions and eat alongside the prisoners and talk to Hayes about the weather or timber prices or nothing in particular. Heinrich began to look forward to those breaks, not just for the food, though the food was always good, but for the simple humanity of it. Porter treating them like employees, like men doing a job, not like enemies to be managed or threats to be contained. One morning in mid-December, Heinrich noticed a photograph tucked into the sun visor of Porter's truck. A young man in uniform, army, maybe 22 years old, strong jaw, serious expression. The photo looked recent. Porter caught Heinrich looking, said something to Hayes. Hayes translated. "That's his son, Robert, fighting in Europe." Heinrich looked at Porter. Porter looked back. Something passed between them. Not hostility, just acknowledgement. Porter's son was probably fighting German soldiers right now, maybe shooting at men Heinrich had served with, maybe getting shot at by them. And Porter was giving Heinrich coffee. Heinrich didn't understand it, couldn't reconcile it. But he accepted the coffee and drank it, and felt something crack a little deeper inside his certainty about how the world worked. The days grew shorter, the work continued, the prisoners grew comfortable with the rhythm. Fell trees, trim branches, haul logs, saw lumber. Coffee at 10 and 3, hot meals back at camp. The routine became normal, and normal felt strange after 4 years of war. One afternoon in late December, Porter stopped Heinrich as he was loading logs onto the truck bed, gestured him over to where he was planing a piece of oak. Porter ran his hand along the grain, then handed the wood to Heinrich. Made a gesture, "Feel this." Heinrich ran his fingers along the grain, smooth, the pattern visible even under sawdust. Porter tapped the wood, then pointed to Heinrich's eyes. Made another gesture. Heinrich understood. Look at it. Really look. The grain told a story. Years of growth, dry seasons and wet seasons, stress and ease, all visible if you paid attention. Porter said something in English. Hayes translated, "Wood shows you what it is. People do too if you look." Heinrich looked at Porter. Weathered face, calloused hands, quiet dignity. A man who'd lost his brother-in-law at Pearl Harbor, whose son was fighting in Europe, who still gave coffee to German prisoners because it was the right thing to do. Porter was showing Heinrich what he was, and Heinrich was learning to see it. They went back to work. But something had shifted. This wasn't just a job anymore. This was Porter teaching Heinrich something about craft, about attention, about respect for materials and people. Heinrich worked more carefully after that, paid attention to the grain, cut clean, made the wood better for being worked. Porter noticed, nodded approval, didn't say anything, didn't need to. Christmas approached. The camp administration announced there would be special meals, extra recreation time, Letters home would be expedited through the Red Cross. Some prisoners became emotional at the thought of Christmas in captivity. Others became withdrawn. Holidays made the distance from home feel sharper. On December 23rd, Porter pulled Hayes aside after work. They talked for several minutes. Hayes looked surprised, then thoughtful, then nodded. He turned to the prisoners. "Mr. Porter is inviting 6 of you to his house for Christmas Eve dinner tomorrow. He wants volunteers who won't cause trouble. Who wants to go?" Silence. The prisoners looked at each other. An invitation to Christmas dinner at an American's house. While the war was still happening, Ernst raised his hand. "I'll go." Heinrich raised his hand. "Me too." 4 others volunteered, men who'd proven themselves steady, reliable, not like Otto and his group who would have treated the invitation as some kind of trap or test. "Good," Hayes said. "We leave at 5 tomorrow evening. Dress clean. Be respectful. Mrs. Porter's a good woman. Don't make me regret this." On December 24th, 1943, Christmas Eve, the 6 prisoners rode in the back of Porter's truck to a white farmhouse 3 miles from the sawmill. The house was modest. 2 stories, wood siding, a wide porch. Smoke came from the chimney. Light glowed in the windows. It looked like every American farmhouse Heinrich had seen in photographs. Peaceful, permanent, untouched by war. Porter led them inside. The warmth hit immediately. A wood stove in the corner, heat radiating through the rooms. The smell of cooking food, rich and complex and overwhelming. Roasting meat, baking bread, something sweet. A woman came from the kitchen, maybe 48 years old, dark hair going grey, strong hands, kind eyes. She wore an apron over a simple dress. She looked at the 6 German prisoners standing in her living room and smiled. Porter said something to her. She nodded and said something back. Then she gestured to a table set with plates and silverware and glasses. "My wife, Ruth," Porter said in slow, careful English. "She says welcome." The prisoners stood awkwardly. This was someone's home, someone's Christmas, and they were enemy soldiers being invited to share it. A small boy appeared from behind Ruth. Heinrich recognized him immediately. Fletcher Whitmore, Leonard Whitmore's grandson, the boy who'd given him a peppermint candy in the cotton field. Fletcher was maybe 9 years old now. He looked at the prisoners and waved. Ernst laughed quietly. "Small world." They sat at the table. Ruth brought food from the kitchen, a turkey. Heinrich had never seen a whole roasted turkey before. 18 pounds at least, golden brown steam rising from it. Porter carved it at the table, cutting thick slices of white and dark meat. Each slice fell away from the bone clean and perfect. Ruth brought out bowls, cornbread stuffing mixed with pork sausage, sage, onions. The smell alone was enough to make Heinrich's mouth water. Mashed potatoes with cream and butter whipped until they were clouds. Green bean casserole with crispy onions on top, the beans still bright green underneath. Cranberry sauce, deep red and glossy tart sweetness you could smell. Sweet potatoes with marshmallows browned on top, the sugar caramelized and cracking. Rolls still warm with butter that melted on contact. She filled their plates. The portions were enormous. More food than Heinrich had seen on one plate in his entire life. The turkey alone was more meat than he'd eaten in a month before capture. He picked up his fork, cut a piece of turkey, put it in his mouth. The meat was tender, juicy. The flavor was subtle and perfect, not overpowering just clean poultry taste with herbs. He chewed slowly, swallowed, cut another piece. Around him the other prisoners were doing the same, eating slowly, carefully. Men whose tongues were telling them things their minds couldn't quite believe. Fletcher sat across from Heinrich. The boy was eating normally, like this was just regular food, because for him it was. This was Christmas. This was what Christmas looked like in America. Abundance, family, peace. Ruth brought out more dishes. Cornbread, biscuits, gravy in a porcelain boat. She moved between the table and the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who'd cooked 10,000 meals. Porter sat at the head of the table eating and occasionally saying something in English that Hayes would translate. Heinrich tasted everything. The stuffing was rich with sausage fat and herbs, the sage sharp and earthy. The potatoes were creamy and smooth, no lumps, just pure comfort. The cranberry sauce was tart and sweet at the same time, cutting through the richness of everything else. The sweet potatoes were candy sweet with the burnt sugar from the marshmallows, a different kind of sweet than the cranberries, deeper and warmer. Every bite was perfect. Every bite was more food than his mother had probably seen in months. He put his fork down, stared at his plate. His eyes were burning. Ernst, sitting next to him, leaned over and whispered in German, "Are you all right?" Heinrich shook his head. "Not all right, not even close." "My mother," he said quietly. "She's eating wallpaper paste, boiled leather, tree bark, and I'm eating turkey." Ernst was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your mother told you to eat. Remember, in her letter. This isn't eating. This is—" Heinrich gestured at the table. "This is obscene." "It's grace," Ernst said. "Accept it or don't. But don't insult these people by refusing their hospitality." Heinrich looked at Ruth Porter. She was watching him with concern. Probably thought he was sick. He forced himself to pick up his fork again, cut another piece of turkey, put it in his mouth, chewed, swallowed. It tasted like ash and guilt and abundance and mercy, all mixed together. Ruth brought out dessert. A coconut cake with 3 layers, white frosting thick as snow, so thick you could see the peaks where she'd pulled the knife away. Coconut flakes covering the outside, catching the light from the oil lamps on the table like tiny pieces of ice. She cut large slices and served them. Heinrich took a bite. The cake was moist and sweet, the kind of sweet that makes your teeth ache but you don't care. The frosting was butter and sugar and vanilla, probably a whole stick of butter in there. The coconut was fresh, not dried, and it melted on his tongue like snow in spring. He forced himself to eat the entire slice, because refusing would have been rude, because Ernst was right, because his mother had told him to eat. But every bite felt like theft. After dinner they sat in the living room. A radio played Christmas music, American songs Heinrich didn't know. Porter smoked his pipe. Ruth knitted. Fletcher played with a wooden truck on the floor. Hayes translated occasional bits of conversation. Then the music stopped. A news announcer came on. Heinrich didn't understand the English, but he heard the words clearly enough. Battle of the Bulge. German offensive. Heavy casualties. The room went silent. Porter's face changed, became harder. Ruth's hands stopped moving. Fletcher looked up from his truck. Porter said something to Hayes. Hayes looked uncomfortable but translated. "He says his son Robert is in Belgium, near where the fighting is happening. He hasn't heard from him in 3 weeks." Heinrich felt his stomach drop. Porter's son was in the Battle of the Bulge, fighting German soldiers, maybe dying while his father fed German prisoners turkey and coconut cake. One of the prisoners, a young man named Karl, said quietly in German, "We should leave." "No," Ernst said firmly. "We stay. We finish the evening properly." The music came back on. Porter relit his pipe. Ruth went back to her knitting. But the ease had gone out of the room. The war had come inside. They left at 9 o'clock, shook Porter's hand. Ruth gave each of them a small package wrapped in cloth. Inside were cookies, gingerbread, still warm. On the truck ride back to camp, no one spoke. Heinrich held his package of cookies and stared at the dark Arkansas countryside passing by and tried to understand what had just happened. Caleb Porter had lost his brother-in-law at Pearl Harbor. Ruth Porter had lost her brother. Their son was fighting in Europe, probably killing German soldiers right now. And they had invited 6 German prisoners to Christmas dinner, had fed them turkey and cake, had treated them like guests. It made no sense. It violated every rule of war Heinrich understood. Enemies didn't feed each other. Enemies didn't show kindness. Enemies were supposed to hate each other. But Porter and Ruth didn't seem to hate them. They seemed to see them as men caught in a bad situation, just like their son Robert was caught in a bad situation, just like everyone was caught. Back at camp, Heinrich lay on his bunk and ate one of Ruth's gingerbread cookies. It was perfect, sweet and spiced and still soft. the molasses dark and rich, the ginger sharp enough to clear your sinuses. He cried while he ate it, quiet tears that he didn't try to stop. Ernst from the next bunk said quietly, "The war is ending. Germany is losing. When we go home, it's going to be hard." "I know," Heinrich said, "but remember this. Remember that your enemies treated you like a human being. Remember that kindness is possible even in war. Remember that not everyone hated you." Heinrich nodded in the darkness. He would remember. For the rest of his life he would remember this Christmas Eve in Arkansas when he ate turkey at the table of a man whose son was fighting his countrymen. He would remember Ruth's smile and Fletcher's curiosity and Porter's quiet dignity. He would remember that war made people enemies, but it didn't have to make them monsters, and that memory would be the most illegal thing of all. January 1945 brought a cold snap. Temperatures dropped to 20 degrees at night. The prisoners weren't prepared. Camp-issued coats were adequate for Arkansas autumn, but not for this. Porter noticed on the second day of the cold, saw the prisoners shivering during coffee break, said something to Hayes. Hayes shook his head. Camp regulations, probably. Porter argued. Hayes shrugged. The next morning, Porter's truck bed was piled with blankets. Thick wool blankets, the kind you use for horses. Porter handed them out, made gestures, wrap up, stay warm. Heinrich took a blanket. It smelled like hay and wood smoke. He wrapped it around his shoulders. The warmth was immediate. Porter pointed to Heinrich, then to the blanket, then made a gesture like sleeping. "Keep it. Take it back to camp." Heinrich nodded. "Danke," he said. "Thank you. Thank." Porter seemed to understand. Nodded back. That night, Heinrich lay on his bunk under Porter's blanket and thought about kindness. Porter's son might be dead by now. The Battle of the Bulge had been going on for 3 weeks, thousands dead, and Porter was giving blankets to German prisoners so they wouldn't be cold. Heinrich didn't understand it, but he accepted it, because refusing would have been an insult to whatever Porter was trying to do. February arrived. The work at the sawmill had developed its own rhythm. Heinrich had learned to read wood grain the way Porter did, could see which way a tree would fall before they cut it, could feel in his hands when the saw was binding and needed adjustment. It was good work, honest work, the kind of work that left you tired but satisfied. Fletcher started coming to the work site more often, 9 years old now, growing, curious about everything. He'd watch the prisoners work and ask questions. One afternoon, Fletcher approached Heinrich while he was stacking lumber, said something in English. Heinrich didn't understand, called Ernst over to translate. "He asks what your country is like," Ernst said. Heinrich thought about that. What could he tell a 9-year-old American boy about Germany? "Tell him," Heinrich said slowly, "tell him it used to be beautiful. Tell him there were buildings hundreds of years old. Tell him people would drink coffee in cafes and argue about philosophy. Tell him my mother would take me to museums on Sundays. Tell him it was a real place with real people who lived real lives." Ernst translated. Fletcher listened carefully, asked another question. "He wants to know if you'll go back," Ernst said. "Tell him I have to," Heinrich said. "But do you want to?" Fletcher asked in broken German. He'd been learning. Heinrich had no answer, because the truth was complicated. The truth was that Germany was home, but Arkansas felt safer. The truth was that duty said go back, but survival said stay. The truth was that he didn't know anymore. "I don't know," Heinrich said finally in German. Fletcher nodded like he understood. And maybe he did. Maybe 9-year-olds understood uncertainty better than adults. Ernst completed his final university examination on January 31st, 1945, passed with high marks. The camp held a small ceremony. 15 prisoners had completed coursework. They received certificates that would be recognized by German universities after the war. That night, the 15 men celebrated in the barracks. Someone had saved chocolate from Christmas. Someone else had cigarettes. They shared everything and talked about the future. "I'll rebuild Germany with law, not war," Ernst said. "That's my contribution. Fair courts, Just systems. Never again what we did. What will I rebuild it with? Heinrich asked. Ernst looked at him. Hands, same as here. You learned timber work, you learned farming. You can fix things. Germany will need people who can fix things. Heinrich thought about that. Maybe Ernst was right. Maybe Germany would need mechanics and farmers and carpenters more than it needed soldiers. But he still couldn't imagine the future clearly. Couldn't see himself in Hamburg's ruins rebuilding. Couldn't see past the guilt and the safety and the coffee at 10 and 3. February 8th, 1945. Caleb Porter arrived at the worksite without his thermos. Heinrich noticed immediately. For 14 months, Porter had brought coffee every morning at 10 o'clock. Stopped work, poured cups, shared the ritual. The coffee was as reliable as sunrise. But this morning, Porter's truck bed was empty except for tools and water jugs. Porter spoke briefly to Corporal Hayes. His voice was flat, emptied of something. Hayes nodded and didn't translate, just told the prisoners to get back to work. They worked through the morning, no coffee break. Porter moved through the site, checking cuts and measurements, but his movements were mechanical. The precision was still there, but the purpose behind it seemed gone. At lunch, Porter sat in his truck cab alone. Didn't eat, just stared through the windshield at nothing. Ernst said quietly to Heinrich, "Something's wrong." "I know," Heinrich said. The next day was the same. No coffee. Porter silent, going through motions. The prisoners worked efficiently, but the atmosphere felt wrong, like something had broken and nobody knew how to fix it. On the third day, February 10th, Porter finally spoke. He called Hayes over after lunch. They talked for several minutes. Hayes's face changed as Porter spoke, became softer, sadder. When Porter finished, Hayes stood silent for a moment, then turned to the prisoners. "Mr. Porter's son Robert was killed in action, November 28th in the Hürtgen forest. The telegram came 3 days ago." The prisoners went still. Heinrich felt the words land in his chest like a physical blow. Robert Porter, the young man in the photograph, 22 years old, dead for over 2 months, but his father only just found out. Killed in the Hürtgen forest, fighting German soldiers. Maybe fighting men from Heinrich's old division. Maybe killed by someone Heinrich had served with. Hayes continued. "Mr. Porter wanted you to know. He says he'll understand if you don't want to keep working for him. Says he won't hold it against you." Nobody moved. What could they say? "We're sorry we killed your son. We're sorry your country's enemies took everything from you." Ernst stepped forward, spoke in his careful English directly to Porter. "We are sorry for your loss. Your son was soldier. We are soldiers. We understand." Porter nodded once, didn't speak, got back in his truck and drove away. The prisoners rode back to camp in silence that evening. Heinrich stared at his hands, calloused from 14 months of work. Strong hands. Hands that had held coffee cups Porter poured. Hands that had eaten food Ruth Porter cooked. Hands that belonged to an enemy soldier while Robert Porter died in a frozen forest. That night Heinrich couldn't eat dinner, just sat at the table staring at his tray. Pork chops again, good food, regular meals, safety and warmth while Caleb Porter buried his son. "You have to eat," Ernst said. "His son is dead," Heinrich said. "That's not your fault." "Isn't it? I'm German. Robert was killed by Germans. How is that not connected?" "You didn't kill him. You were already here when he died." "That makes it worse," Heinrich said. "I was safe, eating bacon, sleeping on a mattress, while he was dying." Ernst had no answer to that, because it was true. The arithmetic was brutal and clear. February 12, 1945. The truck picked them up at the usual time. Heinrich expected Porter to not be there, expected a replacement supervisor, or maybe the assignment would change entirely. But when they arrived at the worksite, Porter's truck was already there, and Porter was standing by the tailgate with his thermos and stack of tin cups. Heinrich stared. The other prisoners stared. Hayes looked surprised. Porter poured coffee, started handing out cups. His face was grey, his eyes were hollow, but his hands were steady. When he got to Heinrich, their eyes met. Porter held out the cup. Heinrich took it. The coffee was hot, black, the same as always. Porter poured the last cup for himself, stood there with the prisoners in the cold February morning, steam rising from the cups. Nobody spoke. Finally, Hayes said in German, "He says he thought about stopping, but Robert's last letter home talked about giving coffee to German prisoners they'd captured. Said they were just scared boys. Said treating them decently was important. So Mr. Porter figures if it was important to Robert, he should keep doing it." Heinrich's throat closed. He couldn't speak, couldn't move. The coffee in his hands felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Porter said something else. Hayes translated. "He says you boys didn't kill Robert. The war did, and Robert wouldn't want him to punish you for something you didn't do." One of the prisoners, Josef, the quiet man from Stuttgart, started crying, just stood there with his coffee cup and wept. Others looked at the ground. Ernst wiped his eyes quickly. Heinrich forced himself to drink the coffee. Every swallow hurt. Not his throat. Something deeper. Some part of him that couldn't process this level of grace. Caleb Porter's son was dead, killed by Germans in a frozen forest. And Porter was standing here giving coffee to German prisoners because his dead son thought it was the right thing to do. That afternoon, Porter called Heinrich over to his truck, spoke in his slow, careful English. "You. Good worker. Robert." He touched the photograph still tucked in the sun visor. "Robert said Germans just people. Like us. You show me that. Thank you." Then he held out his hand. Heinrich took it, shook it. Porter's grip was firm, calloused. The handshake of a working man who'd lost everything, but still believed in something. When Porter let go, Heinrich walked back to the work site and picked up his saw and worked harder than he'd ever worked in his life. Because Caleb Porter deserved good work. Because Robert Porter had died believing in decency. Because some debts could never be repaid. But you tried anyway. That night Heinrich wrote another letter to his mother. Told her about Porter. Told her about the coffee. Told her that Americans treated their enemies with more humanity than he'd ever imagined possible. He still didn't know if his letters reached her, but he wrote them anyway, because witnessing grace required recording it, even if nobody ever read the words. May 8th, 1945. The announcement came at morning assembly. The camp commander stood on a platform and read from a paper in his hand. The war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Hostilities had ceased. The prisoners would remain in custody until repatriation arrangements were completed. Estimated timeline 6 to 12 months. Then the commander stepped down and the guards dismissed the formation, and 3,000 German prisoners stood in the Arkansas sun trying to process what they'd just heard. The war was over. Germany had lost. Everything their generation had fought for had failed. Millions dead, cities destroyed, the country divided and occupied, and Heinrich was standing in a prison camp in Arkansas, well-fed and safe, while his countrymen starved in ruins. Some men wept, others stood motionless, some walked back to their barracks in silence. Otto and his group gathered in a tight knot, talking urgently. Ernst sat on a bench and stared at his hands. Heinrich walked to the edge of camp, to the white painted line that marked the boundary. He'd stood here before months ago, understanding that he could step over it any time, that the prison had no walls because the prisoners had nowhere to go. Now he stood here knowing he'd eventually have to leave, have to go back to Germany, back to Hamburg, back to whatever was left. And he realized with sudden sharp clarity he didn't want to leave Arkansas. Not because he loved America, not because he hated Germany, but because in Arkansas for 2 years he'd been treated like a human being. He'd been given work that mattered and food that sustained him and kindness that made no sense. He'd learned that enemies could show grace, that war didn't have to make you a monster, that redemption was possible even when you didn't deserve it. Going back to Germany meant facing his mother's starvation, His father's death, his brother's absence, the ruins of everything he'd known. Going back meant survivor's guilt so heavy it would crush him. But staying in Arkansas was impossible. He was a prisoner. Eventually, they'd send him home. Ernst found him standing by the line. "Thinking of crossing?" Ernst asked. "No," Heinrich said. "Thinking about what happens when they make us cross back." Ernst nodded. "I've been accepted to continue my law studies at Heidelberg, assuming the university still exists, assuming there's a Germany left to practice law in." "You'll make it work," Heinrich said. "You're smart, determined. What about you?" "I don't know," Heinrich said honestly. "I was a radio technician before the war. That job's probably gone. My city is probably gone. I don't know what I'll do." "You'll survive," Ernst said. "You're good at that." Heinrich wasn't sure survival was enough anymore, but he didn't say that. Summer 1945 passed slowly. The work continued. Cotton planting, timber cutting, road maintenance. The prisoners still earned 80 cents per day, still ate 3 good meals, still had recreation time and university courses and the routines they'd built over 2 years. But the atmosphere had changed. The war was over. The purpose was gone. Now they were just waiting. Waiting to go home to a country that no longer existed in any form they'd recognize. Some prisoners talked about refusing to eat before repatriation, starving themselves down so they wouldn't look well-fed when they reunited with their families. Heinrich understood the impulse, the guilt of returning healthy while everyone else was broken. But Ernst argued against it. Starving yourself helps nobody. Your family needs you alive and strong. Being destroyed doesn't honor their suffering. Most prisoners listened to Ernst. He had that effect on people. Clear thinking, reasonable arguments, a vision of the future that made sense even when nothing else did. In September, the camp announced repatriation would begin in October. The youngest prisoners would go first, then progressively older groups. Heinrich was 26. He'd be in Group 3. Departure estimated for early November. The camp began processing paperwork, medical examinations, final pay calculations, travel arrangements, everything moving toward the inevitable end. Caleb Porter came to say goodbye in late October, brought his thermos one last time, poured coffee for the whole crew, then he handed Heinrich an envelope. "Don't open until home," Porter said carefully. "Promise," Heinrich promised. Porter shook his hand again, held it for a long moment, then he got in his truck and drove away. Heinrich put the envelope in his pocket, felt it there, waited. Leonard Whitmore came by the camp the next day, brought Fletcher, who was now 10 years old. The boy had grown, taller, older, but still had that same curious, fearless way of looking at people. Fletcher walked up to Heinrich and held out his hand. Heinrich shook it solemnly. "Thank you for working on Grandpa's farm," Fletcher said in careful English. His accent was pure Arkansas. Heinrich didn't understand all the words, but he understood the meaning. He nodded, smiled, ruffled the boy's hair. Whitmore shook Heinrich's hand too, held up a photograph. It showed Heinrich and the other prisoners working in the cotton field, summer of 1943. Whitmore pointed to Heinrich in the photo, then to Heinrich standing there, then made a gesture like he wanted Heinrich to have it. Heinrich took the photograph, stared at it. That was him 2 years ago, younger, thinner, more certain about everything. He folded it carefully and put it in his pocket with Porter's envelope. November the 3rd, 1945. The truck to Little Rock train station was crowded, 40 prisoners heading home. Heinrich sat in the back with his belongings in a canvas bag. His final pay had come to $456, converted to occupation currency, more money than he'd ever possessed. He also had Porter's envelope, Whitmore's photograph, his mother's 4 letters, and 47 letters he'd written to her but never sent. All his worldly possessions fit in one bag. The train from Little Rock to New York took 4 days. This wasn't the Pullman car with waiter service. This was a regular troop transport. Crowded, uncomfortable. The food was adequate, but not good. Heinrich ate it anyway. The ship from New York to Bremerhaven was worse. Cargo holds packed with 3,000 German prisoners. Bunks stacked 3 high. The food was sufficient but bland. The voyage took 16 days. Heinrich spent most of it on deck watching the ocean and trying to prepare himself for what came next. November 22nd, 1945. Bremerhaven. The ship docked at dawn. The prisoners filed off and went through processing. German officials checked papers. American officials checked papers. Everything took hours. Finally, Heinrich received discharge papers and a train ticket to Hamburg. The train journey took 3 days. The rails were damaged. The train had to detour around bombed sections. Heinrich watched Germany pass by the window. This was his country, but he barely recognized it. Destroyed cities, burned forests, refugees on the roads, occupation soldiers at every station, women and children digging through rubble, old men with hollow eyes. Everything grey, everything broken, everything dead. This wasn't the Germany Heinrich had left in 1941. This was something else. Something that didn't have a name yet. Hamburg was worse than he'd imagined. The city centre was gone. Just rubble and burned-out buildings. Block after block of nothing. The residential districts were unrecognizable. The streets he'd grown up on didn't exist anymore. Heinrich found the refugee centre on the outskirts, a converted school building, crowded with displaced people. He asked about his mother. A clerk checked a list, pointed to a room number on the 2nd floor. Heinrich climbed the stairs, knocked on the door. A woman answered. Not his mother. Someone else. But she recognized his name. Called out, "Frau Vogel, your son." His mother appeared in the doorway. She was 52 years old but looked 70. Her hair had gone completely grey. She'd lost at least 40 pounds. Her face was gaunt. Her hands shook. She stared at Heinrich for a long moment like she didn't believe he was real. Then she started crying. Heinrich held her. She was so light, just bones under her coat. He could feel her ribs, her spine. She felt like she might break if he held too tight. She cried for 5 minutes, didn't speak, just held him and cried. Finally she pulled back, looked at his face, touched his cheeks, his shoulders, his hands. "You're so strong," she whispered. "So healthy." "Mama," he said. That was all he could manage. She led him inside. The room was maybe 12 feet square, 4 beds, a small table, a stove. She shared it with 3 other women. Heinrich would sleep on the floor. She made tea from dandelion roots, served it in chipped cups. The tea was bitter, earthy, nothing like Porter's coffee. It tasted like survival and ashes and the end of everything. Heinrich drank it anyway. They talked until late into the night. She told him about the bombing raids, about watching their neighborhood burn, about finding out his father was dead, about never hearing from Klaus again, about living on 800 calories per day for 2 years, about eating wallpaper paste and boiled leather and tree bark. Heinrich told her about Arkansas, about the camp, about Caleb Porter and Leonard Whitmore, about cotton fields and timber operations, about the food, about the hot showers, about the medical care, about being treated like a human being. She listened without judgment. When he finished, she asked quietly, "Would you go back to America if you could?" Heinrich thought about the question. About the Arkansas sun and Porter's coffee and the white painted line that prisoners could step over any time but never did. About Ruth's coconut cake and Fletcher's curiosity and Ernst's university courses. About being safe while the world burned. "I don't know, Mama," he said. But he was lying, and they both knew it. That night, Heinrich lay on the floor with his canvas bag as a pillow, listened to the November wind blow ash and dust against the windows, listened to his mother's laboured breathing in the darkness, listened to the city that no longer existed. He reached into his pocket, felt Porter's envelope, still sealed. He'd promised not to open it until he was home. And now he was home. What was left of it? He opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in careful handwriting. Heinrich, thank you for your good work. You honored Robert's memory by being decent. If you ever return to Arkansas, you have a friend here. Caleb Porter, December 1945. Heinrich read it 3 times, then folded it carefully and put it in his wallet, right next to his mother's first letter, the 2 most important documents he owned. He lay back down, stared at the ceiling he couldn't see in the darkness. Yes, he thought, if I could go back, I would. Not because I love America, not because I hate Germany, but because in Arkansas I was treated like a human being, and that's the most precious thing in the world. The years passed. Heinrich found work as a clerk in 1946, 45 marks per month. He moved his mother to a better room in 1947, 2 beds instead of 4, their own stove. It was progress, slow, hard, but progress. In 1948 he met Margaret, called Greta, a nurse at the hospital. She was kind, patient, practical. They married in June. She never asked much about the war, just accepted that he'd been a prisoner and came home. Their daughter Helga was born in 1949. Their son Klaus, named for Heinrich's lost brother, in 1952. They moved to a new apartment in 1955 as Hamburg slowly rebuilt itself. Heinrich got a better job, better pay, a normal life, or as normal as life could be for men who'd seen their world destroyed. He never spoke about Arkansas, never told his children about cotton fields or Caleb Porter or Christmas dinner with a family who'd lost everything. When Helga asked about the war, he just said, "I was captured in North Africa. The Americans treated us well." That was all, those 2 sentences, his entire war reduced to 14 words. But Caleb Porter's letter stayed in his wallet, folded into a small square, creased and worn from being opened and closed hundreds of times. Heinrich would take it out sometimes late at night when he couldn't sleep. Read it. Remember. In 1960, a letter arrived from America, from Fletcher Whitmore, now 25 years old. He'd inherited his grandfather's farm. He'd found Heinrich's name in some old camp records, wrote to say hello, to say he remembered the quiet German man who'd worked in his grandfather's fields, to invite Heinrich to visit if he ever returned to America. Heinrich wrote a reply, spent 3 days on it, tried to explain that he couldn't return, that the memories were too complicated, that he carried too much guilt about surviving well while others suffered, that seeing Arkansas again would break something in him that had taken 15 years to barely hold together. But he never sent the letter, just folded it and put it in the wooden box where he kept Porter's letter and his mother's letters and all the unsent letters he'd written during the war. All his ghosts, all his guilt, all carefully preserved in a box in the back of his closet. His mother died in 1966, Greta in 1994. His children had children. Life continued. Heinrich retired. The world moved on. But some nights Heinrich would sit by the window and read Porter's letter and remember bacon and coffee and kindness that felt illegal. Would remember that in the worst war in human history, in a prison camp in Arkansas, he'd been treated with a humanity he didn't deserve. And he would cry, quietly, where nobody could hear, because he understood something most people never learned. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do to someone is let them survive with their dignity intact. And sometimes that kindness is so illegal, so impossible, so against every rule of war that it changes you forever. Caleb Porter had done that. Ruth Porter had done that. Leonard Whitmore and Fletcher and Corporal Hayes and even Ernst Bachmann had done that. They'd shown him that mercy was possible, that enemies could be human, that grace existed even when everything said it shouldn't. Heinrich Vogel carried that knowledge for 52 years, carried it in his wallet where Porter's letter lived, carried it in his silence where all the words he couldn't say piled up, carried it in his tears that came late at night when he remembered what it felt like to be treated like a human being. And on May 12, 1997, when death came for him in a hospital room in Hamburg, Heinrich Vogel died holding that letter, holding proof that mercy had existed once, that grace was real, that kindness could survive even war. His daughter found the letter, didn't understand it. Not then, but she would, eventually, because some stories are too big to die with the men who lived them. Some kindnesses echo across generations, some mercy lasts forever. And Heinrich Vogel's story of bacon and coffee and illegal kindness deserved to be remembered, even if he never could speak it aloud. Helga's daughter Marie was 28 years old when she found the wooden box in her mother's attic. Inside were letters, dozens of them, some from her grandfather to his mother, never sent, some from his mother to him, describing starvation and bombing raids, and one letter from someone named Caleb Porter in Arkansas. Marie read them all, every single one. The unsent letters to his mother were the hardest, 47 of them, all dated between June 1943 and November 1945, all describing food, all describing guilt, all ending with, "I love you, Mama." September 20th, 1943. Dear Mama, today they gave us bacon for breakfast, 6 pieces. I ate them slowly and thought of you. I know you're hungry. I know you're suffering, and I'm eating bacon. I don't understand why I deserve this. I don't understand any of it. I love you. Heinrich. November the 3rd, 1943. Dear Mama, today, a small boy gave me a peppermint candy. I cried. He asked why. I couldn't explain. How do you tell a child that kindness breaks you when you don't deserve it? I love you. Heinrich. December 25th, 1943. Dear Mama, last night I ate Christmas dinner at an American's house, turkey and potatoes and coconut cake. I thought about you eating whatever you could find and I wanted to die. But his wife smiled at me and said, "Welcome," and I couldn't refuse without insulting them. So I ate, and every bite tasted like betraying you. I love you. Heinrich. Marie read all 47, each one a small confession, each one a tiny prayer, each one saying the same thing in different words: I'm safe and I shouldn't be, and I don't know how to live with that. Then she Googled Camp Dermot, Arkansas, found historical records, found POW lists, found Heinrich Vogel's name. She contacted the Arkansas Historical Society. They connected her with local historians, who connected her with a man named Fletcher Whitmore, 75 years old, still living on his grandfather's farm. In April 2010, Marie flew to Arkansas. Fletcher met her at the Little Rock airport, drove her to the farm, the same farm where her grandfather had picked cotton 67 years ago. I remember Heinrich, Fletcher said as they drove through the Arkansas countryside. Quiet man, hard worker, cried when he left. I was just a kid 10 years old. I didn't understand why he was crying. We'd been good to them, fed them well, treated them fair. Why would leaving make someone cry? He didn't want to leave, Marie said quietly. Fletcher glanced at her. That's what I figured out later. Your grandfather and the other men, they were safer here than anywhere else in the world. Going home meant facing what the war had done. Some of them didn't want to face that. He pulled into a gravel driveway. The farmhouse was still white, still had the wide porch. Smoke came from the chimney even in April. Still heat with wood, Fletcher said. Some things don't change. He took her to a small museum in town. Local history, World War II exhibits. There was a section on the POW camps, photographs of prisoners working in fields, a list of names on a bronze plaque. 3,000 German prisoners worked Arkansas farms 1943 to 1945. Marie scanned the names, found it Heinrich Vogel, Hamburg, Germany. She stood there crying. Fletcher put a hand on her shoulder. Your grandfather helped us, Fletcher said. During the war we had no workers. Every man was either drafted or volunteered. The prisoners saved our farms, and we tried to treat them right. My grandfather always said they were just men caught in a bad situation, like everyone else. Marie wiped her eyes. He never told us. My mother never knew. He kept it secret his whole life. Guilt, Fletcher said. Men like your grandfather carried shame instead of pride. They survived when others didn't. They ate well when others starved. That's hard to talk about. Fletcher drove her back to the farm, showed her the fields, the same fields Heinrich had worked. Cotton's still king here, Fletcher said. Different varieties now. Machines do most of the work, but the land's the same. He took her into the barn, opened an old trunk, pulled out the photograph Leonard Whitmore had given Heinrich in 1945. Found this in Grandpa's things after he died. Summer 1943. Your grandfather's in there somewhere. Marie looked at the photograph. 20 German prisoners in a cotton field. Young men, thin, working with hoes. She couldn't tell which one was Heinrich. They all looked the same, exhausted and confused and strangely hopeful. "Can I have this?" Marie asked. "It's yours," Fletcher said. "Been waiting 70 years for someone to claim it." That evening, Marie sat in her hotel room in Little Rock, opened her laptop, searched through digitized archives, found something she'd missed before. Camp Dermot records, prisoner letters, digitized 2008. She clicked, found her grandfather's name. 47 letters appeared, all marked unsent, found in personal effects, 1945. Marie read them all again, on the screen this time, official records. Proof that Heinrich Vogel had written these confessions and never sent them, had carried them home and kept them hidden for 52 years. She closed the laptop, looked at the photograph Fletcher had given her. Young men in a cotton field. One of them was her grandfather, carrying guilt he'd hold forever. "You deserved the bacon opa," Marie whispered. "You deserved the kindness. You deserved to survive. I wish you'd believed that." The next morning, Fletcher took Marie to one more place. A small cemetery outside town. Confederate graves, Union graves, local farmers, and a separate section added in 1990. POW Memorial Garden, Fletcher said. There were no graves, just a memorial wall with names. 3,000 German prisoners who'd worked Arkansas. Most went home. Some died here. All were remembered. Marie found her grandfather's name again, ran her fingers over the engraved letters. Heinrich Vogel, Hamburg, Germany. Yi Ju Si Sankara Yi Ju Si Wu. Fletcher handed her a small bouquet of wildflowers. Arkansas flowers, native to this land. Marie placed them at the base of the memorial. "Thank you," she said, to Fletcher, to Arkansas, to the memory of Caleb Porter and Leonard Whitmore and Ruth and everyone else who'd shown kindness when they didn't have to. Fletcher nodded. "Your grandfather worked hard for us, saved our farms. We owed him this much. Took us too long to say it properly." They stood in silence for a while. Then Fletcher said something that made Marie's breath catch. "I found something else in Grandpa's papers. Letter from your grandfather, postmarked 1960. He wrote back when I invited him to visit. But he never mailed it. Don't know how Grandpa got it. Maybe Red Cross found it in the camp and forwarded it. Anyway, you should have it." He handed her an envelope. Old, yellow, addressed to Fletcher Whitmore, Arkansas, USA. Never sent. Opened anyway. Marie opened it. Read her grandfather's words from 50 years ago. "Dear Fletcher, thank you for your invitation. I cannot return to Arkansas. Not because I don't want to, but because the memories are too painful. Your family showed me kindness I did not deserve. I ate at your table while my mother starved. I slept safely while my father died. I cannot face that kindness again. It would break me. Please understand. I carry your grandfather's memory with love and shame in equal measure. I hope you have a good life. I hope America treats you as well as you treated me. Thank you for remembering me. Heinrich Vogel." Marie folded the letter carefully, put it in her purse next to Porter's letter and the photograph. 3 documents, 3 pieces of proof that Heinrich Vogel had been treated with illegal kindness, and that kindness had been too heavy to carry but too precious to forget. Marie flew home to Germany the next day, showed her mother everything. The letters, the photograph, the memorial. Helga cried. Why didn't he tell us? Because he couldn't, Marie said. Because saying I was treated well meant saying I survived while others suffered. He couldn't separate the two. They framed the photograph, hung it in Helga's apartment. Young men in an Arkansas cotton field. One of them was Heinrich, carrying guilt that would last a lifetime. And sometimes Marie would stand in front of it and think about illegal kindness, about how mercy can feel like theft, about how surviving can feel like betrayal, about how grace can be the hardest gift to accept. Her grandfather had learned that in Arkansas, had learned that being treated like a human when you expect cruelty changes something fundamental in your soul, had learned that kindness from enemies is more transformative than hatred from friends, and he'd carried that knowledge in his wallet for 52 years, folded into a square small enough to hide, creased from being opened and closed 10,000 times. Read in darkness when sleep wouldn't come. Proof that Caleb Porter had existed. Proof that mercy was real. Proof that even in the worst war in human history, some men chose grace over vengeance. That was Heinrich Vogel's secret. That was what he died holding. That was what he couldn't speak about, but never forgot. And now, finally, someone understood. Illegal kindness. Impossible mercy. Unreasonable grace. The most precious things in the world.